Ay, 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 hadoidi, ligras kala, pene Shabbos nekavela. Hello, Marley sisters and brothers. We're getting ready for Shabbos. That's the beautiful classic song Lecha Doidi. I just shared the lyrics to it actually on the page. It was written in the 16th century by Rabbi Shlomo Halevi. What's the last name? Makablitz? It's based on his last name right now. But it was written in the holy city of Sfat, in that circle of Kabbalists who would go out on Friday night a beautiful bride. Others, let us light up the darkness with some Torah as we head into Shabbos. It's Erev Shabbos. It's the time right before Shabbos. What a great thing to be learning together with who says Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Wishing all a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Thank you, Nina Sal, for all the meaningful teaching. Thank you, Yehudis, and everybody for being part of the community. Rochelle says Shabbat Shalom. Angie Espinoza wishing Shabbat Shalom. Desde Columbus, Ohio. Tom says good Shabbos. Bill with us from Arkansas. Donna saying glory to him in the day of rest. Shabbat Shalom. Razy, Shabbat Shalom from New York. Lucy from Minnesota. Nancy from North Carolina. Chaim from Charlotte. And Paul Kunis from Minneapolis. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn with us from North Texas. And I believe, Lynn, that you were talking about the disqualifying blemish of a priest in the temple. You mentioned that yesterday, the day before, and you were anticipating today's Mishna clearly, so you were right about that. All right, everybody, let's get into it. Where are we holding? This is Daf Kuf Gimel, page 103. Of 105 pages in Tractate Eruvin, which means our siyum, our completion celebration, scheduled for Sunday at our regular time, 6 p.m. You'll want to be with us. Bring a l'chaim, something to drink and make a bracha, something to eat, something to nibble on, usually a grain product, a muffin, a cookie, etc., something like that, so we can make a bracha together. As we complete Tractate Eruvin, we'll say a few prayers about that, and then read the first few lines of our next tractate, Pesachim, the laws of Pesach. And we have a little bit of a preview of some of the laws of Pesach in what we're learning today. We are in our fundraising season. If you love what we do, if you believe in it, if you're a regular in our class here at AT Daily, think about becoming our partner and supporting our work by supporting our nonprofit, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and share in the merit of sharing Torah with so many people around the world. Becoming a monthly donor, even better. You put a small amount, but put it in so that it's coming every month to us. Beautiful way to share in the mitzvah. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'ach kol nihmidi v'ro. And you say amen when I make a bracha on water. Okay, so this is chapter 10. As we've talked about already a few times, the sages are throwing in just a last few important teachings here as we're leaving finally our study of the laws of Shabbos after more than 250 pages by Sunday. And these last few Mishnas all share this theme that the laws, in terms of rabbinic decrees, Torah laws are the same everywhere, but in terms of rabbinic decrees, there's a difference between when you're on the grounds of the Holy Temple and everywhere else. Why? Because, the Holy Temple has so many of its own laws about the sacrifices and what the priests who serve there can and cannot do. Who are the priests? The Kohanim. They are the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. When they're serving, there was a lot of priests over time in ancient Israel. They would sort of divide themselves into groups, and they would serve for 1 week at a time, usually twice a year. And so there was a squad of priests, as it were, who were serving in the temple, and they were already very well trained and very vigilant, and they had a lot of duties to perform. And the rabbis did not feel the need to add extra decrees onto them, to protect them from coming to violate Torah prohibitions, since they were vigilant, well-trained, and had enough to do. So rabbinic decrees often did not apply in the temple, whereas they would apply everywhere else. Some rabbinic decrees do apply even in the temple because the priests would benefit from that protection. But a lot don't. And these last few Mishnas here in chapter 10 of Tractate Eruvin are making that distinction between rabbinic decrees that apply everywhere else but do not apply in the temple, whereas laws that are applying universally, it's because they are Torah prohibitions. And right now we're not dealing with rabbinic decrees that apply both outside the temple and within the temple. All right, so let's get into this. Today we're covering Mishnah 15 and 16 here on page 103. We're going to end the page a little early. We're going to do Mishnahs 17 and 18 tomorrow night, Saturday, Motzi Shabbos, after the end of Shabbos. And then on Sunday, we'll do... Wait, let me just make sure I'm saying that right. Yeah, we're going to do 15 and 16 today. We're going to do 17... and 18, 17 and 18 tomorrow night, Saturday night, with God's help. And then the last mission number 19, we'll cover on Sunday as we make our CU. Okay, so let us read this Mishnah number 15. It's actually found at the bottom of page 102. Okay, that Mishnah, very short Mishnah. One may tie up on Shabbos a string that came loose from a harp used in the temple, but not in the rest of the country. And tying the string to the harp for the first time is prohibited both here and there. Now, let's just get a few things out of the way so we understand what we're talking about here. So first of all, who was playing a harp on the temple grounds? That was the job not of the priests, but of the Levi'im. The Levites. I happen to be a Levite, right? So the Levites are the descendants of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. It's the tribe of Levi. And actually the priests are, Aaron and Moses were Levites, so the priests are also Levites, but it's a much more, elite group, the priests. But the Levites also served in the temple. There were many more Levites than priests. What was their job? They were the choir, right? So the Levites, in addition, they had other duties as well, serving the priests, helping out with the duties of the temple. But one of them was singing and even playing music in the temple grounds. And that was a mitzvah. So the Levites, when they're singing and playing music with their instruments, are fulfilling a mitzvah. That's permitted on the temple grounds. Elsewhere, we'll cover this law that you not only can't fix an instrument on Shabbos, you're prohibited to use an instrument on Shabbos, certainly in a synagogue, right? So these days, in Reform and conservative synagogues, they will use instruments, but in an Orthodox synagogue, you will never find that. Singing, obviously, is going on big time, and, people will drum sort of by, clapping or banging on a table. There's going to be a lot of raucous music going on, but not playing of instruments. Why? We'll cover that at another time. But one aspect of that would be a rabbinic decree that you might come to fix the instrument if it broke, particularly if you break a string. And here we have that teaching right there in this Mishna that, if you broke a string of an instrument, outside the temple, you can't fix that. But inside the temple, you can fix it, right? It says in the temple, you can fix it. Now, right away, the Gemara is going to bring a contradiction from a Baraisa, and then we're going to see if we can reconcile this contradiction between the Baraisa and the Mishnah. The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraisa. If a harp string broke, one would not tie it with a knot, but rather would fashion a bow. So as we've seen elsewhere, some sages distinguish between a knot and a bow, and some don't. What would the difference be? A knot is permanent. It's intended to remain tied. A bow is clearly a temporary knot. So maybe on Shabbos, as we know, we can tie our shoes, but as we've learned before, like if you have a sandal, there are two kinds of knots on the sandal. There would be the bow knot that you tie whenever you put the sandal on, tie the strap so it stays on your feet. And there would be those other permanent knots that just stay tied, and that really, like the one who manufactured the sandal, he made those knots, and they were not intended to be undone every time you took the sandals on and off. On Shabbos, you could tie the bow, but you could not tie those permanent knots, the knots that are intended to be permanent. And likewise here, this Baraisa is making a distinction that, well, if the harp string broke in the temple, but we're talking about in the temple, so you would tie it with a bow and not with a regular knot if that happened on Shabbos, right? If a harp string broke, one would not tie it up with a knot, but would fashion a bow. This teaching indicates that tying up a harp string is prohibited even in the temple, right? Because there's no distinction being made that in the temple that you wouldn't use this bow. According to the Baraisa, even in the temple, you would use a bow and you wouldn't try to make a permanent knot if your harp string happened to break on Shabbos. So then the Gemara comments, okay, according to this contradiction, la kasha, not a difficulty, right? We can reconcile this. It's not a problem. The Baraisa, which prohibits tying a permanent knot, was taught in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, and the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. What is Rabbi Eliezer talking about? So Rabbi Eliezer, we learned on page 130 of Tractate Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer, who's by no means, Mr. Leniency, who's going to do leniencies all over the place. But back then, we learned he was definitely more lenient than the other rabbis with respect to the question, may we conduct the activities that would otherwise be prohibited on Shabbos in order to do the preparations necessary to perform a mitzvah, a commandment, that overrides Shabbos. What were we talking about then? We were talking about a circumcision. When an eighth day, a Jewish baby boy must be circumcised on the eighth day if he is healthy enough for that to happen. If for some reason he's jaundiced or something, or they're going to delay it, then it doesn't have to be on the eighth day. Then it's going to be the first available day, which he's healthy enough to have the circumcision, and which is not Shabbos or a festival. But if he is a healthy boy and they're going to do it on the eighth day, then even if the eighth day falls on Shabbos, we perform the bris, the circumcision, on Shabbos. We would also perform it on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah or any other holiday. And we recently had, actually, a circumcision on Rosh Hashanah here, or not this year, but last year in our neighborhood. So, but Rabbi Eliezer took it a step further. And he said, well, whatever is necessary for that mitzvah, which overrides Shabbos, we can also do that on Shabbos. And he actually went quite far with that leniency and said, for example, if you're going to do a circumcision on Saturday, you can carry the knife, even through a public domain, which normally you can't carry. And even if you didn't have a knife, and you needed to fabricate the knife, and you needed to build a fire in order to forge the iron and hammer it out. I mean, these are all labors that for sure you cannot do on Shabbos. But if you needed to do them because there was no knife available, in order to perform the circumcision, the 8th-day circumcision, which overrides Shabbos, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that would be permitted. Rabbi Akiva disagreed. Rabbi Akiva said, we certainly override Shabbos to perform an 8th-day circumcision. But in terms of manufacturing the knife or doing any other activity which itself violates a Torah prohibition, something that's not permitted to do on Shabbos, if it was possible for you to do that before Shabbos, then you must do it before Shabbos, and it's prohibited to do on Shabbos. So any preparation for the mitzvah that could have been done before Shabbos, you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. That's the Mishnah we had back at Shabbos page 130. So here we're talking about tying a string that broke on a Levite's harp in the temple, right? So to play, it's not a mitzvah, it's not a commandment to play music on a harp anywhere else but the temple, all right? So there it's a commandment to play it, and it overrides Shabbos. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, okay, so if the string breaks, you tie it so that you can continue to do that. And not only that, according to this understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, he would even permit tying the string for the first time. Now that's a minority opinion, right? The rabbis would say, who hold like Rabbi Akiva, no, you can tie that on Friday for the first time. But if the string broke on Shabbos, okay, well, you couldn't have anticipated that it was going to break on Shabbos. So this is not something you could have done before Shabbos, let's say Friday afternoon. So according to that view of Rabbi Eliezer, certainly, and perhaps even the rabbis, according to Rabbi Akiva, since you couldn't have done it before Friday, it would be permitted to do it on Shabbos, to fix a string, but not to tie one for the first time. Okay, so the Gemara is saying, so if the Mishnah accords with Rabbi Eliezer, it wouldn't be talking only about fixing a string. If the Mishnah really accorded with Rabbi Eliezer, as opposed to the Baraisa, which contradicts it, right? So the Baraisa, which said, if the harp string broke, one may not tie it with a knot, but fashion a bow, which would indicate that you can't fix it with a knot, right? You can't fix it with a knot. But here the Gemara is saying that if the Mishnah accorded with Rabbi Eliezer, it wouldn't talk about fixing. It would say you could even tie it for the first time. Rather, la kasha, it's not a difficulty to reconcile this Mishnah and this Baraisa. How do we do it? According to this view, the Mishnah accords with Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda said, you know, whether you're tying a knot that's permanent or a bow, it's the same thing, not permitted on Shabbos. That's Rabbi Yehuda. But the rabbi said you can tie a bow on Shabbos, you can't tie a permanent knot on Shabbos. So the Mishnah accords with Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a bow and any other kind of knot is the same. But the Baraisa accords with the rabbis who say that a bow is not tying. So if you're going to fix that harp string on Shabbos, you do it with a bow. But does Rabbi Yehuda hold like Rabbi Eliezer that tying is permitted in the first place? Right? Rabbi Eliezer would say even if it wasn't a broken string, even if you were attaching it for the first time, that would be allowed on Shabbos. But Rabbi Yehuda, we have no reason to believe that he would go that far. So that doesn't square our reconciliation of the Mishnah and the Baraisa. Rather, another approach, la kasha, it's not difficult. The Baraisa accords with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon, who says in another Baraisa, if a Levite's string broke on Shabbos, we fix it with a bow, and the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon say we tie it. All right, so that really addresses the situation because this is preparation for a mitzvah that could not have been done on Friday. But Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, different Rabbi Shimon, says actually tying the harp string that broke in the temple on Shabbos is no good. No good. It's no good to tie it when it broke. Not because he objects to fixing a harp string on Shabbos, but rather because if you tie a knot in a harp string, it's not going to sound good. And playing the harp on Shabbos or any other time in the temple so that the priests and anyone who's visiting the holy temple when it's standing, it hasn't stood in 2,000 years, but God willing, the Messiah will come, Mashiach will come, and then the third temple will be rebuilt. And then the Levites will be singing in the temple again. They'll get better singers than me, I'm sure. And then if a harp string broke on Shabbos, you wouldn't want to just tie it according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. You need to unwind the string and reinstall it so that it sounds good. Now, he offers a method where you can maybe reinstall it, but it's not like installing it the first time. But he's acknowledging that you can't just make some kind of temporary fix if the instrument itself is not going to sound good. It has to sound good, right? It has to be good. The music in the temple has to be heavenly, right? That's what Shimon ben Elazar is telling us. And where do we finally come out? The law is, let's read the halacha, if a string breaks in the harp in the holy temple, it is permitted to tie a temporary knot for the purpose of a mitzvah. One may tie a broken harp string in the temple, but not outside of it on Shabbos. However, it is prohibited to tie a knot in the first instance, even in the temple. So whereas Rabbi Eliezer would permit us ab initio to tie that string even on Shabbos for the purpose of the mitzvah, since the preparation for a mitzvah is permitted on Shabbos, if the mitzvah itself overrides the restrictions of Shabbos, that's only per Rabbi Eliezer. The rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and the halacha, the law, accords with the rabbis who disagree with and outnumber and outvote Rabbi Eliezer. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah 15. Now we go to Mishnah 16. Let us read it. Mishnah 16 is a little bit, bodily. So here we go. Mishnah 16. A wart is an example of a blemish that temporarily disqualifies a priest from performing the temple service and disqualifies an animal from being offered on the altar. They regain their fitness once the wart is removed. Consequently, on Shabbos, one may cut off a wart by hand in the temple, as this constitutes a preparatory act required for the sacrificial service. However, he may not cut off a wart in the rest of the country, and if he seeks to cut off the wart with an instrument, it is prohibited in both places. Now, according to the view that we just saw of the rabbis, that something which could have been done on Friday but wasn't done on Friday, is that going to be permitted to be done on Shabbos? They said no in the case of, bringing the blade or sharpening the blade or even manufacturing the blade. Rabbi Eliezer would have permitted those things. The rabbis would not. So this wart, maybe it could have been cut off on Friday. And now they're saying, no, but in the temple, it can be removed. But it can't be removed elsewhere. Why? Because that rabbinic decree that it won't be allowed to do elsewhere is not going to apply in the temple. However, the Gemara right away raises an objection from another teaching. Now, this time, it's not an objection from a Baraisa, it's an objection from another Mishnah. Now, Mishnahs are the most authoritative statements of rulings of the rabbis, so when one Mishnah contradicts another Mishnah, they need to be reconciled. When a Mishnah contradicts a Baraisa, they'll attempt to reconcile it, but if they can't, at the end of the day, the Mishnah overrides the Baraisa. But when two Mishnahs contradict each other, they have to figure out what's going on. Usually it's that one of the Mishnas is missing some kind of information, or we're not aware of what the case that was being described was. And once we understand that, we see that there's actually no contradiction. And that's the work that the rabbis are going to do here in this discussion. So what is the Mishnah that contradicts our Mishnah? Our Mishnah is, right, that if a priest has a wart that's going to disqualify him from bringing sacrifices on the altar in the temple, he may cut off the wart by, here it just says he may cut off the wart in the temple. The Rav Steinsaltz adds in the elucidation, because it's going to come up later, he can do it by hand. But here it says he can cut off the wart in the temple, but elsewhere we may not cut off a wart on Shabbos, and neither in the temple nor anywhere else may he cut off the wart using an instrument, right? So using a blade. So rather he could use his fingernail, or he could bite it off, or he could yank it off, but he can't cut it off with a knife. And outside the temple, you can't do it at all. What is the contradictory Mishnah? When Passover Eve occurs on Shabbos, the acts of carrying the Paschal lamb on one's shoulders, bringing it to the temple from outside the Techum, that's outside the Shabbos boundary. Here on page 103, if you've been with us, you know what the Shabbos boundary is, the Techum. You can only walk 2,000 cubits from your dwelling. If you live in a town, your dwelling is considered to fill the whole town, so you can only walk on Shabbos 2,000 cubits from the edge of your town. But maybe you had to bring this Paschal lamb all the way to Jerusalem because it's Shabbos Eve. In other words, when Shabbos begins Saturday night, right? So it begins on Sunday. When Passover is on Sunday, so it begins Saturday night. So Erev Pesach, the time before Pesach, which is when we slaughter the Paschal lamb, happens right before Passover begins. Passover begins Saturday night. So then it's on Shabbos that you would need to slaughter the Passover lamb. It's 100% prohibited to slaughter animals for eating or any reason. You don't slaughter on Shabbos. But in order to slaughter the Paschal lamb on time, which has to be done Erev Pesach, right before Pesach begins, that slaughtering does override the restrictions of Shabbos. So here, this Baraisa is talking about, okay, we're going to slaughter it on Shabbos, but what about carrying it to bring it to the temple in order to slaughter it? What about carrying it further than the distance permitted to walk on Shabbos outside your boundary? And what about removing a wart from the Paschal lamb? Because if the lamb has a wart, it's disqualified from being a Paschal lamb. But if you remove the wart, now it can be a Paschal lamb again. So can you do those things on Shabbos? So the Mishnah says, right, when Passover Eve, Erev Pesach, occurs on Shabbos, the acts of carrying the Paschal lamb on one's shoulders, bringing it to the temple from outside one's Shabbos boundary, and cutting off its wart to render it fit for the altar, do not override the prohibitions of Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer says they do override. So Rabbi Eliezer is consistent with his own opinion. Just like you can carry or even manufacture the knife to do an 8-day circumcision on Shabbos, likewise you can carry the Paschal lamb on your shoulders through the public domain. You can walk further than your Shabbos boundary, and you can remove the wart from the Paschal lamb on Shabbos, because these are all preparations for a mitzvah that overrides Shabbos. Eliezer permits that. The rabbis prohibit, and as we saw before, why would they prohibit? Because this could have been done before, right? Bringing it out of your boundary, bringing it to Jerusalem, removing the wart, all of that could have been done before Shabbos. Could have been done Friday afternoon, then you slaughter it Saturday afternoon, and you cook and start cooking it, and then you eat it, right, Saturday night when it's Passover. Okay, hold on a second. Let me get my notes in front of me. Okay, so how do we reconcile this? Because the Mishnah seems to be saying that in the temple, the priest can remove a wart from himself on Shabbos so that he can do his duties as a priest. But the other Mishnah seems to be saying we may not remove a wart, at least from an animal, from the offering on Shabbos, even though we need it so that we can do it that night. How do we reconcile this contradiction? One is with a human, one is with an animal, but in both cases, we're removing a wart from a living being on Shabbos. One Mishnah permits, the other Mishnah prohibits. So Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yosei ben Hanina are going to attempt some different approaches to reconcile these contradictory Mishnahs. We're going to summarize the discussion a little bit. One approach is, well, there's a difference between a moist wart and a dry wart, right? So the Mishnah that prohibits removing the wart is talking about a moist wart, meaning it's the wart itself is part of you and is alive. Whereas the one that permits it in the temple, removing it from the priest, is talking about a wart that's already dried out. It's already starting to crumble. It's basically ready to fall off. We saw this also, like on Shabbos, you can't cut your fingernails. You can't bite your fingernails. You can't tear off your cuticles. You can't tear bits of yourself off. Why? By the way, what is the prohibition of removing warts or cutting your fingernails or shaving or anything on Shabbos? It's actually harvesting, right? You're harvesting you're cutting off a living thing from a living thing. In the same way that you can't pick an apple off a tree on Shabbos because that's harvesting. You can't pick living things off yourself. But when we studied about nails and cuticles, we saw that if it was already just about to fall off and you could remove it in an atypical manner, typical would be to use a little scissors or something and cut it off, or a knife. Atypical would be to remove it with your fingers or to, pluck it off with your fingernail or even bite it with your teeth. And so that might be permitted if it was already falling off, right? If it was already falling off. And likewise here, one approach to these warts is, the wart is already dried out. It's about to fall off by itself. That we could remove. But if it's really, like a wart that's on a person, it's not going anywhere, it's still, got fluid inside, whatever, that would not be permitted to remove that wart. That's one approach to handling this contradiction, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? Doesn't solve the problem because maybe that's not what was intended. Maybe the priest can remove even a moist wart. So what else might we say? Well, we might say there's a difference between removing it by hand or removing it with an instrument. Again, the typical manner of removal of harvesting would be with some kind of a blade. If you remove it by hand, you're doing it in an atypical manner, and maybe that's why it's going to be permitted in the temple for one priest to remove his wart. As we saw, even in that Mishnah, it said with a blade, with an instrument, it's not permitted. So obviously it would only be permitted not with a blade, which presumably would be by hand or teeth or something like that. Now, Rabbi Eliezer would permit cutting a wart even with an instrument, right? As we've seen, Rabbi Eliezer permits activities that are necessary to perform a mitzvah. So what is the mitzvah? In this case, it's the priest bringing offerings on the altar. He's doing a very big time important mitzvah, bringing offerings on behalf of the Jewish people or on behalf of somebody who's bringing a sin offering or a thanksgiving offering or a peace offering, etc. That's an important whole category of mitzvahs, of commandments that are in the Torah. And the priest would, he can't fulfill that obligation for himself and the people he's representing if he has a wart, but if he removes the wart, then he can. So Rabbi Eliezer presumably would permit him to remove the wart even with an instrument, but the Mishnah said not with an instrument. So this Mishnah apparently does not accord with Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Yosef says, where's Rabbi Eliezer coming from? Why does Rabbi Eliezer permit one to do these things? Like, where does he get where does Rabbi Eliezer come from when he says that the preparatory acts for a mitzvah are also going to be permitted? The rabbis say no, right? The rabbis say if you can do that before Shabbos, then it's not necessary to do it on Shabbos, so don't do it on Shabbos. It's prohibited. Why would Rabbi Eliezer disagree and say it's permitted on Shabbos? So Rabbi Eliezer makes a kal v'chomer. What is a kal v'chomer? Okay, it's a type of argument where we say, well, if in an easy case we're stringent, then in a tough case, for sure we're going to be stringent. Or if in a tough case we're lenient, then in a more lenient case, for sure we're going to be lenient, right? So what is Rabbi Eliezer saying? He's saying like this. If the slaughter overrides Shabbos, right? So we know that. You can slaughter the Paschal lamb, the Passover lamb, on Shabbos. That is spelled out for sure. I think it's actually in the Torah. So if Passover falls on Saturday night, then Saturday afternoon on Shabbos, you're going to slaughter that lamb. And that means, by the way, that there were thousands of people coming to Jerusalem, all bringing lambs. And, if you're a vegetarian, this image is not for you. But it was like the floor of the temple on Passover, the afternoon before Passover night. I mean, there was just a lot of blood there. We have images elsewhere in the Talmud that it was like, the whole ground was covered in a thick layer of blood, because thousands of people were bringing their lambs so that night they would roast the lamb and recall the Exodus from Egypt, when the children of Israel in their homes, where we were slaves in Egypt, that night we ate the roasted lamb. We kind of roasted it quietly in our homes. And there's all kinds of laws about groups have to prepare to do this. They all have to bring a lamb together. They all get slaughtered that afternoon, and then that night they're roasted and eaten. So, slaughtering is something normally we definitely don't do on Shabbos, but on Erev Pesach, right before Passover, we do it. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, if already we're engaged in a big, what would be a transgression of Shabbos, because it overrides Shabbos in order to do Passover properly, then are we going to stop and say, no, but carrying the lamb to the temple, we're not going to do, and removing a wart from the lamb, we're not going to do, and walking further than we normally are allowed to walk on Shabbos, we're not going to do? Already we're slaughtering thousands of lambs on Shabbos. Of course we're going to do these smaller transgressions because they are attendant, they are part of the mitzvah of, slaughtering, roasting, and eating the Passover lamb on Passover. That's how Rabbi Eliezer would justify that he allows the preparatory actions for a mitzvah to also be done on Shabbos. So that's how Rabbi Eliezer would rule. Now, Rav Yosef says, hold on a second. Rav Yosef says, okay, so that's Rabbi Eliezer, but it's not clear that these two Mishnas that disagree with each other, that we're going to remove the wart, it's because it accords with Rabbi Eliezer. It might not be that the reason the priest can remove the wart is because it's preparatory, or maybe that's because it's preparatory. But what about the fact that the other Mishnah says we cannot do those other activities right outside the temple, that we cannot bring the lamb, and that we cannot remove a wart from the lamb, and that we cannot carry the lamb on our shoulders? According to Rav Yosef, the reason that this might also accord with Rabbi Eliezer, because what he's saying is, in terms of that Mishnah, what happens outside the temple, right? In the temple, yeah, we're gonna slaughter the lambs because that's done on the temple grounds. But bringing the lamb, carrying the lamb through the public domain, removing the wart, that's not on the temple grounds. That happens outside the temple. So even though we relax a rabbinic decree inside the temple grounds, maybe we don't relax it outside the temple grounds. Actually, that's not according with Rabbi Eliezer. That's according to the other rabbis. And even though it's a temple-related activity, we're not going to permit it, even though it's a temple-related activity, because those actions actually happen outside the temple. That's what Rav Yosef is saying. So then Rav Safra raises an objection to Rav Yosef's understanding of this. And he says, there's yet another Mishnah that if we are, we have to cook the lamb, right? So after we bring the lamb and then the priest slaughters the lamb, then we take the lamb back, right? Some of it is offered in the temple. I think some of the blood is sprinkled on the altar. But then the people take their lamb back, right? And they roast it. And then everybody who has registered in that lamb is going to eat it that night. These are all the people making a Seder together on Passover night. They're going to eat that lamb. Now that lamb, it's permitted to lower it into the oven for cooking right before the holiday begins, or if Passover falls on Shabbos, right? So this is a little different. If Passover falls on Shabbos, it's Friday night. So Friday afternoon, normally you can't start cooking something right before Shabbos begins. The law that we saw earlier in Tractate Shabbos is things can continue cooking on Shabbos. That's how we have cholent. But it has to be mostly cooked, primarily cooked, before Shabbos starts. However, with the Paschal lamb, with the Passover lamb, we can put that in the oven so it just starts cooking even right before Shabbos starts, late Friday afternoon. So that's an exception to the rabbinic decree that we don't start cooking something right before Shabbos begins. Why don't we start something cooking right before Shabbos begins? It's actually not about that we're going to be cooking, literally cooking on Shabbos. They're also concerned that if you do that, people are going to come to stir the coals, right? And you can't touch fire. A fire can just kind of burn on its own and die down over Shabbos. But if you stir the coals, that's considered like kindling, and you can't do that on Shabbos. So there's a rabbinic decree. You can't put something in the oven, I guess maybe even if it was already primarily cooked, you still can't put it right into the oven right before Shabbos begins because you might come to stir the coals. But with the Passover lamb, that is permitted, right? That is permitted. So according to Rav Safra, we see right here, we see that this is something that is temple related, but is happening outside the temple. They're going to be roasting that Passover lamb outside the temple, and it's permitted. And that would have, so therefore Rav Yosef's idea of reconciling the two Mishnas by saying, well, you know, we don't have, we do away with rabbinic decrees, certain rabbinic decrees in the temple, but if it's something that's outside the temple, we uphold those rabbinic decrees. Here, Rav Safra would say, well, this is a rabbinic decree that's happening outside the temple for something that's temple related, and we do relax the rabbinic decree. So that method of reconciling the two Mishnas isn't going to work. So Rava brings a different approach. He's going to say, the way we reconcile these two Mishnas is that Rabbi Eliezer, he allows preparation for a mitzvah that's going to override Shabbos. He allows the preparation acts to also happen on Shabbos. However, if it's possible to adjust those things, those preparatory actions, a little bit in deference to Shabbos, we're going to do that. Rabbi Eliezer would agree that we're going to do that, right? So we have a baraisa which says there's a priest with a wart, and in this baraisa, that to help explain Rabbi Eliezer's view that he allows the preparatory acts, but we adjust them so that they don't violate Shabbos as much, right? So in this baraisa, we say, okay, we have a priest who wants to, it's his turn to serve in the temple. He has a wart, so he can't do he's disqualified from bringing offerings on the altar. According to the baraisa, his fellow priest, it says his fellow, but presumably another priest, can bite the wart off for him. A little gross, but bear with me. So his fellow can bite the wart off for him. Now, why his fellow? I mean, if it's permitted to bite off the wart, let him bite it off himself. Why is he going to have his friend do it? Right? So Rabbi Eliezer normally says that one who, see, there's the thing, Rabbi Eliezer, here we've been dealing, like he allows these preparatory activities. So we think of him as somebody who's more lenient in these laws. But in yet another dispute, Rabbi Eliezer was more stringent than the other rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer said, if you bite off your fingernail or a cuticle or a wart, it's not just that you have violated a rabbinic decree, it's that you violated that Torah prohibition on harvesting, and you become liable to bring the sin offering. Apparently, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer over there say, okay, that's not really harvesting. It's prohibited, but you're not violating a Torah law. It's just prohibited because you may come to remove those things with a blade, right? They prohibit not on account of it's harvesting to bite it off, because that's an atypical manner to remove a wart, but rather it's prohibited because you may come to remove the wart with a blade. So that's how the Eliezer and the rabbis disagreed over there. Eliezer said you're liable if you bite off the wart. The rabbis say it's prohibited, but you're not liable to bring the sin offering. So over here, why would you say in this baraisa that your friend can bite it off for you? It's only by rabbinic decree, not according to Rabbi Eliezer, but according to the rabbis. It's only by rabbinic decree that you can't bite off your own. But I guess they're going to say if your friend bites it off, it's like less of a violation. Or let's say it's according to Rabbi Eliezer. I think this is actually what's intended. Rabbi Eliezer says you violate a Torah prohibition by biting off your wart. But if your friend bites it off for you, that's going to be less, right? Because he's not harvesting a wart from his own skin. He's just helping you out, and you're not doing it to yourself. So that has to be by rabbinic decree rather than actual Torah violation, and it's a way to lessen, the ways that you're violating Shabbos. So here too, but this doesn't work because according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you're able to do preparatory acts for a mitzvah on Shabbos, what difference does it make? You bite it off, your friend bites it off, you do it with a blade, without a blade. Rabbi Eliezer should permit all those things, even though normally with respect to warts, he says that is violating a Torah prohibition. So the Gemara says, actually, this baraisa accords with the rabbis who say that biting off a wart is only prohibited by rabbinic decree, not a Torah violation. Why is the baraisa saying your friend should do it rather than you should do it? It's just a practical matter. They were only talking about the fact that you might have a wart on your back and you can't bite it off yourself. So it's going to be okay for someone to do it for you. Rabbi Eliezer is going to prohibit biting. I'm going to say that. And where did the law finally come out? I'm almost done here, so if you have questions or comments, I'm coming to it now. The law came out like this. It is prohibited to cut off a wart on Shabbos, whether by hand or with an instrument, and whether the wart is dry or moist. If one cuts off a moist wart with an instrument, he is liable to bring a sin offering, right? So cutting off with an instrument, the normal way to remove it, you violated the Torah prohibition of harvesting on Shabbos. Boom. You're liable to bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. If you remove it a different way, it's prohibited, but you're not liable. In the temple, however, it is permitted to cut off a moist wart by hand and a dry one, even with an instrument, because it was going to fall off anyway. But as we see, even in the temple, it's not permitted to cut off a moist wart with an instrument. Rabbi Eliezer presumably would permit that preparatory action to fulfilling a mitzvah on Shabbos, but the rabbis overruled Rabbi Eliezer, and that is not permitted. With respect to the Paschal lamb, bringing it from outside the Shabbos boundary, it is prohibited to carry the Paschal lamb on one's shoulders in the public domain on Shabbos, or to bring it from beyond the Shabbos boundary, or presumably to remove a wart, as these tasks could have been performed before Shabbos. Okay, that's what we've got today. We got a little bit bodily, as it were, with those warts. But, that's the law, warts and all. Okay, Lynn. Thanks for the comments about wounds on serving priests. And for musical instruments, certain knots allowed or not for a broken string implies instruments are in use on Sabbath everywhere. No? I mean, I don't know if that rule hadn't been, passed yet, but it's definitely not allowed now, right? So for sure, at some point, the rabbis decreed no musical instruments. Definitely not on Shabbos, because you could come to repair it, to carry it. You could ask, can one play guitar at home on Shabbos? I'm sure the answer is no. I'd have to look it up to be 100% sure, but no. It's not permitted. That's as far as I know. I mean, this question could certainly be researched more. I know that in liberal synagogues, religiously liberal synagogues, they're using instruments on Shabbos, but in traditional Orthodox synagogues, that's not happening. Lynn says, I guess you covered it, but at the time this ruling cited under discussion seems to be a ruling prior to the late. Okay, great. You made the same comment a little later. Tom says, my synagogue held a bris on Yom Kippur in 2003. Absolutely, right? So an 8th day circumcision overrides any other restrictions, not only of Shabbos or Rosh Hashanah, but even Yom Kippur. That's a difficult circumcision in the sense that normally we celebrate and, there's a lot of good food and l'chaim. Yom Kippur, okay, so you're not eating a snack to celebrate. You're still having all the joy. You can still sing, but the fast continues, right? So eating at the circumcision is not going to override Yom Kippur, but the procedure itself will. Mitchell says, saw this post, so I'm coming in late. So Robert Hunter... okay, so this refers to the title, and if my tunes were played on the harp unstrung. So Robert Hunter, who wrote these lyrics for the Grateful Dead song Ripple, got the words from the Talmud. No, I'm not saying that. It just occurred to me, that since we were talking about a harp and whether it may be strung, a broken string may be repaired on Shabbos or not. I mean, I just thought of it because Ripple is, maybe my favorite song, definitely up there. And I do believe a very, very spiritual, mystical song that I do believe the sages would enjoy. But, no, I'm not making any kind of connection in saying that Robert Hunter was aware of these teachings from the Talmud. Bill, I'm glad Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar got to that point. I've been sitting here the entire time wondering how good these harps could possibly sound if the string were added in such a fashion as described, right? So it's a good point. Shimon ben Elazar is saying, like, okay, you're going to fix it, but you got to fix it in such a way that you could still fulfill the mitzvah of playing the harp and playing beautiful music in the temple, right? If you tied a knot, but now you can't play the instrument, what was the point of tying the knot? Then you would have actually violated Shabbos in vain. So it's an important point that Shimon ben Elazar is making, and you too, Bill. And Rochelle says, please translate the word la kasha, meaning no difficulty. It's Aramaic, means it is not difficult. So that's a phrase that we're going to hear when two teachings of the sages seem to contradict each other. And they're going to say, no, there's no difficulty. There's just something that we haven't understood yet. There's additional facts, or there's a case that this law was applied in, which we're not aware of what the facts of that case were. And when we realize why the ruling was made in that situation, we realize that the ruling, which it seems to contradict, given the same circumstances, would have come out, similar, and therefore there is no contradiction. So la kasha, no difficulty. We can reconcile two rulings that seem to contradict each other. And that's important, right? Because the idea is that it's the eternal law of the Torah, right? So we don't want to have a situation where great sages, they certainly argue with each other, and they're going to come out in opposite places. But once they figure out what the law is and the majority vote and the whole thing, if then later, an official ruling like a halacha, a law, an established law, contradicts another established law, that's very problematic. Then people don't know what to do. How are they meant to behave if they got two teachings that are telling them to do opposite things? And so whenever we find those contradictions, the rabbis have to find a way to reconcile them. If, like I said before, if a Mishnah contradicts a Baraisa, then maybe we'll just follow the Mishnah because it's more authoritative. But when two Mishnahs contradict each other, we have to figure out a way to reconcile them, either by adding additional facts or additional nuances, etc. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Quite a journey we took from harps to warts. Tomorrow night, with God's help, we'll do Mishnahs 17 and 18, which are found on page 104. And then Sunday night, we make our siyum, our completion of Tractate Eruvin, with God's help. after we reach page 105. It's a short page. We'll make a celebration. We'll read a couple prayers and make some blessings. We should have a little l'chaim, something to drink. If alcohol's not your thing, whatever, some pleasant beverage, something to eat, as well as traditional. And we'll open just the first few lines of our next tractate, which is in fact the laws of Passover. So this was a nice little preview of what we're going to get into in the laws of Passover. That's it. You should have may the peace of Shabbos, may the Sabbath bride who's coming in tonight enfold you in the arms of peace. May God's peace come down upon you like the dew of heaven. May you and your loved ones feel that Sabbath peace and enjoy it and be healed by it in your life. I think the whole world needs the peace of Shabbos right now. And we should all be blessed with Shabbat Shalom, Sabbath peace. All the best.